Hello, my name is Adrian Glue, Tate's archivist. I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome from everyone working in Tate's Library and Archive for this online Émigré Art Archives Symposium, supported by the Marie-Louise von Motochitsky Charitable Trust, which is coming live this afternoon from the Hyman Kreitman Reading Rooms at Tate Britain. For those who may not have come across Tate Archive before, we house the National Archive of British Fine Art Practice here at Tate Britain. Having just celebrated our 50th anniversary, we now hold more than 1,000 archive collections, amounting to 20 million pieces relating to a diverse range of artists and arts organisations. Material collected ranges from correspondence, writings and preparatory artworks to photographs, press cuttings and increasingly born digital material. Although we have a staff of 7 to manage our holdings, we are often reliant on our supporters to enable us to have the fullest support to catalogue our largest collections. Today's symposium is a case in point as it marks the culmination of a 3-year project generously funded by the Marie-Louise von Motochitsky Trust to catalogue and selectively digitise 3 key archive collections relating to émigré art housed in Tate Archive. The sketchbooks of Polish émigré Janka Adler, the professional papers of the art historian and Czech émigré J.P. Hodin, and the Viennese family papers of curator David Mayer. I'm delighted to announce that through the unstinting work of my colleague and project cataloguer Peter Eves, who you will hear from shortly, and ably assisted by our former colleague Andrei Lazarev, all 3 of these collections are now fully catalogued and available to access online at archive.tate.org.uk. We also welcome personal visits by researchers who can register and make appointments to consult items in our reading rooms, which are open Mondays to Thursdays from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. The Émigré Art Archives project has witnessed many outputs with such as key texts translated from German into English by our dedicated and embedded translator Jonathan Blower, which have been added to relevant metadata on the online catalogue. And by the end of the month, digitised images from the Hodin and Mayer collections will join those of Adler's sketchbooks recently added online. And finally, I am pleased to say that the second of 2 commissioned films about J.P. Hodin and his circle, directed by Henrietta Norton, will shortly join the one on Janka Adler via YouTube. So I'm delighted to announce that there'll be what we can call a world premiere of the Hodin film, screened after the Adler film during the comfort break. So do watch out for these AV treats later. Coming back to the programme and speakers, I'm pleased to say that we have a stellar lineup of academics who will present a series of short papers reflecting aspects of all 3 of these recently catalogued archives. The Trust funding has enabled us to engage as a dedicated convener for the symposium an experienced émigré art facilitator and curator, Joe Rosenthal, who will kindly introduce each of our speakers today. As you may have seen when registering, their biographies are available from the events homepage. Suffice to say that Glenn Suho and Sarah McDougall will start proceedings by discussing aspects of Adler's work and recognition. This will be followed by a Q&A session facilitated by Joe. Then, following the comfort break and the film screenings, the second half of the symposium will see Alexandra Lazar and Rachel Dixon examine J.P. Hodin's legacy followed by a fitting final paper by Ines Schlenker, exploring David Mayer's Viennese connections to Marie-Louise von Matuszewski and her family. There will also be a chance to ask questions via the chat after the conclusion of this panel too. As a finale to all that, we will hear this afternoon, I'm very pleased to say that we will be joined by the eminent Émigré art historian and chronicler Monica Boehm-Duchesne as the symposium's respondent. With all of this to look forward to, I will now hand you over to Joe to cover any housekeeping points before my colleague Peter tells you a little bit more about the 3 collections catalogued and his work on the project. So over to you, Joe.
Thanks very much, Adrian. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you joining us live today, wherever you may be. We're so delighted to have you with us for this very special event. And although we aren't able to be together in person, it's fantastic to be with you in this moment as a virtual community of artists, archivists, art historians, curators, students, and enthusiasts from all around the world. Given the transnational focus of the event, it seems fitting to be utilising technology to stage this across borders and time zones. It has been a tremendous pleasure for me over the past months to serve as convener for this symposium, working with Adrian and his team at Tate Archive, and the excellent speakers who we're fortunate to have been able to gather here for you today. Having had a preview of the papers, I assure you that you're in for a treat. As Adrian has said, none of this would have been possible without the generous funding of the Marie-Louise von Matuszewski Trust, and I extend my thanks to the chair, Francis Carey, and all at the Trust for their support of this important work. So just before we begin, a quick word on housekeeping. As you've heard, we have 2 panels for you. The first will focus on the artist Yankel Adler, and the second will look at the art historian J.P. Hodin and the family archives of artist David Mayer. At the end of each of these 2 panels, we've set aside some time for a Q&A, which is your opportunity to pose your questions to each of the speakers. And we would love for you to submit your questions as they emerge throughout the event. So the way to do this is by using the Q&A function, which you'll find on your screen. And we'll do our best to work through as many questions as time allows. So now, without further ado, I will hand over to Peter Eves, the project cataloguer who has worked extensively with these 3 archives, to share his insights and thoughts on the material. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Joe and Adrian. First thing I'd like to say is just how pleased I am to be here today to speak about a project which I've been involved with in many respects for over the last 4 years. And when I first began this task, it appeared a very daunting one. 3 archive collections comprising over 300 disorganised boxes of materials in a variety of languages and varying in legibility from spidery to impenetrable. It's the clicker somewhere. Back then, I could only dream of the day when I would be able to talk about these collections and refer to them as the organised and accessible resources which they have now become. So today, I would like to talk briefly about each of these 3 collections and share something of my own thoughts on what they have to tell us. For the first stage of the project, I turned to cataloguing the 16 sketchbooks of the Jewish-Polish artist Yankel Adler. Now, Tate Archive has a fantastic collection of sketchbooks. They're obviously a very popular reading room request here at Tate Britain, not least because of their beauty as objects, but also for what they can offer us, an unguarded glimpse of the artist at work, how ideas emerge, develop and crystallise. The earliest of these 16 sketchbooks date from 1927 and the last from 1949, the year of Adler's death. The intervening years were full of upheaval, and the sketchbooks allow us to witness the impact of the cataclysm of the Second World War on an artist and their work. Like so many others, Adler's life was torn asunder by the conflict. He lost his family, many of his friends, and an entire way of life. And at times these sketchbooks provided the only means for Adler to work as an artist when the prevailing circumstances denied him the calm of the studio environment. So we find in these sketchbooks an immediate reaction to the Émigré experience, played out before our eyes across the pages. And it is so pleasing to see all of these sketchbooks digitised and conserved, as well as a film about Adler now available online. The most extensive of the three collections in the project are the papers of the art critic Joseph Paul Hodin. Born in Prague in 1905, a precocious young Hodin was writing poetry and short stories by the age of 9, and his ambitions as a young man were to make a career in this regard, taking his inspiration the artists he had met in the cafes of Dusseldorf, Berlin and Paris. But following a move to Stockholm in 1935, he turned his attention firmly and forever in the direction of art criticism, when his knowledge of art and ability to understand the person behind it won the admiration of journal and newspaper editors in the country. There is an excellent representation in the archive of this formative and difficult period in Hodin's life, including the final letters from his parents who were murdered in a concentration camp in 1942, and the many desperate appeals and letters Hodin sent to remove them from danger. Hodin left Sweden after 10 years, bound for London, where he would live and work for the rest of his life. And he brought with him an expertise about a host of continental artists hitherto unknown in Britain, particularly those of the expressionist tendency which Hodin held a great affinity for. But it was also natural that Hodin would concern himself with the plight of those European artists who, like himself, had made Britain their home before the Second World War. And to this community, Hodin was the perfect representative, someone who shared a similar experience, was understanding of where they had come from and also where they now were. So Hodin's career spans 6 decades and has resulted in an archive numbering over 250 boxes. The scale of the archive owes much to this longevity as a critic, but also to his particular methodology of assiduous research and never writing of any subject without knowing them personally. And thus we find for each of his major subjects batches of what we have termed working papers, containing letters, questionnaires and artistic statements sent by artists in response to Hodin's often persistent demands. We also find reams and reams of Hodin's draft texts, notes, and in some cases, the results of his usage of investigative techniques, such as graphology, astrology, which he claimed could reveal unconscious strivings and failings in his artistic subjects. These working papers form the majority of the archive, varying in size from a single folder on, for instance, Graham Sutherland, to the 34 boxes devoted to Hodin's great friend Oskar Kokoschka. And they proved a challenge to catalogue, as the materials had been left exactly as Hodin had last used them. So it was important for us to strike a balance with the cataloguing between preserving this contextual record of his working habits, while also bearing in mind the clarity and accessibility of the catalogue for those who would be navigating it. The working papers related to Elsa Meidner deserve special mention here. Elsa had emigrated to Britain in 1939 with her husband and fellow artist Ludwig. They returned to Germany in 1953, but Elsa soon came back to live in London. And having lived in the shadow of a perhaps better known husband as an artist, Elsa now struggled to make a living by any means, let alone as an artist. Hodin became her most ardent supporter and urged galleries to exhibit her work. He penned articles and in 1979 a monograph. These working papers contain a wonderful series of letters in which Elsa writes with touching candidness of the difficulties of her life and sends Hodin poems, short stories and musical pieces over a 20-year period. And this is a perfect example of the concern which Hodin held for the cause of the lesser-known artists, those whose reputations did not make it intact across the Channel, but whose experiences now live on within this archive. It is also an aspect of this project that forgotten names can be brought to the fore again, especially so thanks to the wonderful translations provided by the project's translator, Jonathan Blower, which has opened up these and many other materials across the 3 archive collections. The final element of the project involved the cataloguing of the family papers of David Mayer, a curator and publisher and scion of several interconnected Austrian families. David is the grandson of Annie Shea von Koromler, née Schindler, an amateur artist and successful actor in turn-of-the-century Vienna. Annie's first marriage had been to the physicist Robert von Leben, which established a lifelong connection to the von Matuszewski family. She later remarried, but the marriage had failed by the early 1930s, after which time Annie emigrated with her 3 children to Britain. This archive provides a history of succeeding generations of an émigré family through time, and via these documents we can follow the progress of a family from the end of the 19th century into the tumultuous 20th century, and are then brought up to date by the activities of a member of the 3rd generation. Of particular note is a cache of letters sent by an aspiring poet and artist, Edward Renouf, to Annie from the years 1930 to 47. The letters describe the story of a love affair between an aspiring young writer and a supportive older woman, both of whom emigrated from the German-speaking countries to the Anglosphere in the early 1930s. Edward to New York, Annie to London. It is rather a tragic story of unrequited love, the breakdown of a marriage, the fragile mental health of sender and recipient, and the steadily diminishing fortunes of two formerly wealthy families. These three wonderful archive collections have a great combined story to tell us, and with the translations from German into English, have become so much more accessible to all. They take us from the scattered homelands across the European continent in the late 19th century to London in the 21st, documenting how an initial generation established themselves and how later generations built upon these foundations and continued their ancestors' contribution to the cultural landscape of their new homeland. And finally, all that remains for me to say is just watch this space, because over the coming weeks, additional digitised images from both the Mahodin and Mayer collections, which are currently being processed, will be made available online via the Tate Archives Digitised Collections page. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Welcome to our first session on the artist Yankel Adler. And I'm delighted to be joined by Glenn Sujo and Sarah McDougall for this session, both of whom have engaged in great depth with Adler in different ways in their research and curatorial practice. First to present will be Glenn, who will share his gleanings from Yankel Adler's sketchbooks. Glenn Sujo is an artist, author, and educator. He has contributed actively to the recovery of drawing language in art polemics and higher education through practice-led research, exhibitions, and publications. His original research in museums, libraries, and archives in Central and Eastern Europe culminated in exhibitions and publications on the subject of the imagination in internment. These include Legacies of Silence, The Visual Arts and Holocaust Memory, Imperial War Museum, London, 2001, Artist Witness the Shoah, Graves Art Gallery, Sheffield, 1995, and On the Track of Tyranny, the Wiener Library, London, 1983. Glenn is a contributing author to several volumes exploring visual art and the Holocaust, including a forthcoming article, Art of the Holocaust, Conundrum and Complexity for the Cambridge History of the Holocaust, 2024. Glenn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joanne. A number of titles published in the 1990s, now part of the canon, chronicled the flight of artists and intellectuals from countries under Nazi occupation to the West, a movement described by Karen Michels as, I quote, the most momentous transmission in the history of 20th century scholarship. More recent accounts have highlighted their lasting legacies in countries that, like Britain, offered sanctuary to those fleeing persecution. In their introduction to Forced Journeys, Artists in Exile in Britain, 1933 to 1945, authors Shulamit Ber and Sandra Gilman recognized the inherent contradictions and productive tensions that accompanied exile, invoking the words of the Palestinian-born critic and cultural historian Edward Said's Reflections on Exile. To see the poet in exile, as opposed to reading the poetry of exile, is to see exile's antinomies embodied and endured with a unique intensity. For Ber and Gilman, Said's reflections on the conditions of enforced exile reveal a perilous territory of non-belonging, of unpredictable states of being, of loss of native geography, family, and language, adding that, I quote, the new immigrants that arrived in Britain after 1933 brought an experience of alienation to an already discomfited Britain. With this brief preamble in mind, it seems appropriate to acknowledge the contribution of a distinguished colleague and friend, Dr. Shulamit Ber, who did much to advance the field of émigré studies and was responsible for bringing us together on previous occasions in November 2009 and again in 2013 to consider émigré artists and their archives. We recall her quiet but persistent presence, her thoroughness and dedication as a teacher and scholar of considerable originality. A Festschrift in her honor is planned early next year on the anniversary of her lamentable death. Attuned to the predicament of exile, this eye-catching illustration in Karl Arnold Kortum's satiric poem, Opinions and Deeds of Hieronymus Jobs the Candidate, also known simply as Die Jobsiad, circa 1780 to 84, lampoons the ceaseless wanderings of its fictional protagonist. Yet its humorous intent belies a more serious reflection on one of the divisive issues of our time, the forcible displacement of peoples driven by war, famine, persecution. Kortum's is a journey of the imagination through Europe and the Mediterranean, its territories demarcated by a dotted line and bound not for Jerusalem or the Kingdom of Judea, the vaunted destination of pilgrimage in maps of Christendom, but to Constantinople, latter-day Istanbul, as the small crescent moon above the pointed temple-like building on the right suggests, the seat of a powerful Ottoman Empire, still largely intact at the end of the 18th century, when Die Jobsiad was published. Kortum could not have foreseen, or indeed dreamt of, the inferences of this small wood engraving, its aerobatic, zigzagging lines anticipating modernism's experiments, and the instructional drawing manual of one of the 20th century's most inventive draftsmen, Paul Klee's pedagogical sketchbook of 1925. Its prodding and provocative arrows direct our attention helter-skelter across the white page. Klee's maxim, quote, an active line on a walk, moving freely, without goal, a walk for a walk's sake, unquote, is axiomatic of modernism's experiments with line and the drawn mark, and places a high bar on notions of artistic agency, privileged spontaneity, and expression explored in this presentation. Childlike in its apparent simplicity and directness, Klee's Burdened Children intimates a more serious purpose with its bizarre, joined up, homunculus-like figures on the move, freighted with the accoutrement of travel. Their playful appearance belies a premature, adult awareness of the realities of homelessness, aimless wandering, and exile. There follows a brief introduction to the sketchbooks of the Polish-Jewish artist and Émigré. Notice the two hyphenated couplets there. Yankel Adler, 1895-1949, with occasional references beyond this corpus, notes on his working method and notational systems, and their place in the modernist canon. Raised in a traditional Jewish household in the rural outskirts of Łódź, at the heart of Poland's textile industry, and often compared to Manchester, the eighth of 12 siblings, Adler was drawn to Eastern strains of Hasidic mysticism at a precocious age, and soon after to more radical expressions of Yiddishkeit, the culture of Eastern European Jews, reflecting the Jews' growing participation in the artistic, scientific, and intellectual life of a newly restored independent Poland after the First World War. This move was often accompanied by gradual assimilation into the mainstream hegemonic culture and language. Within months of founding the short-lived Young Yiddish Avant-Garde Circle, Adler and fellow activists, artists, and poets, Marek Schwartz, Vincenty Brauner, Moshe Broderson, drafted a spirited manifesto proclaiming this hybridity. Quote, we are realists in our mystic beliefs. Authenticity and truth have not come too soon. Adler's mature works would combine these early strands of Yiddishism, the expression of a distinct identity and language, with first-hand knowledge of the salient currents of international modernism, Cubism, Futurism, Expressionism, Neue Sachlichkeit, and geometric abstraction, and an engaged cosmopolitanism with its perceived promises and failures, its peculiar forms of association, insiderness and marginality, its geographical inflections, conjuring languages, metropoles, centres and peripheries. In a far-reaching essay on the occasion of the Arts Council's Yankel Adler Memorial Exhibition in 1951, the critic Michael Middleton described the artist's self-appointed task as, quote, to catch the vigor of Picasso, the scale of his bold inventions, and express them with the perfection, intimacy, and musical finesse of Klee, unquote. Adler achieves this task in The Mutilated, begun in Glasgow and completed in London at the end of May 1943, registering the war's destruction, painted over a still inchoate, unformed, densely applied ground made up of layers of dragged paint. Adler overlays tense, angular lines that reveal its subject. Two veteran amputees absorbed in an indolent pastime, a cat's cradle of sorts, their massive sculptural forms marooned on some desolate beach or no man's land. The work conveys a sense of the powerlessness and isolation Adler must have experienced while in exile, cut off from events in Europe and adrift from family and friends. Shores here are construed with a twofold meaning, as containing limits conferring insularity on an island mentality, wary of outsiders, and as places of meeting and welcome exchange. The group of 16 sketchbooks by Adler uncovered after the artist's death at Olborne, Wiltshire in April 1949, and now at Tate Archives, admirably convey the choices and prerogatives open to this displaced individualist and uprooted nonconformist. All 16 books, and you would see 12 of them on this screenshot of Tate's very attractive webpage, have been exhaustively digitized and can be studied online, one page at a time, the blank pages in between providing punctuation, anticipating the constellation of marks that will inevitably flow onto the next page in an unrelenting stream of invention. At times of uncertainty or in flight, Adler's sketchbooks offered surrogate domicile, the words of the exiled poet and returnee Hilda Domine, which echo this predicament. I quote, "Exile, impossible to lose. You carry it with you. A desert, pocket-sized," unquote. Intellectually restless, impatient, and prone to doubt, Adler's sketchbooks suggest a contested terrain of converging, diverging paths, bridging auspicious beginnings and thwarted endings. The earliest, inscribed upper right, 5th of March 1939, not a completion date or terminus adquem, more likely a pause in the book's gestation, can be traced back as far as 1927 and forward to June 1940. During this time, Adler opened the book at random, working outward from the center, covering 63 extant folios. Together with the artist's talit, his ritual prayer shawl, this was among his most cherished possessions, secreted on his person during the perilous channel crossing from the port of Saint-Nazaire in northern France to Britain, in the retreat of Allied forces in June 1940, in what became known as Operation Ariel. The sketchbook chronicles his peripatetic wanderings, Düsseldorf to Berlin, Łódź to Warsaw, Mallorca to Paris. Its end pages reveal a growing admiration for the renowned painter and muralist Fernand Léger, whose works Adler had rediscovered during a sojourn of 18 months in the coastal town of Cagnes-sur-Mer, within striking distance of Biot and Juan-les-Pins, today associated both with Léger and with Pablo Picasso, of course. The animated contours of young woman with cat, initially drawn in pencil, later reinforced with the point of a brush, conjure an arresting, if wholly imagined, feminine other. Her flattened head, combining profile and frontal views, framed by a mop of tightly crenellated hair, her broad shoulders that taper to a narrow waistline, all confirm this impression. A cat perched on her left shoulder is a recurring, revelatory symbol of nonconformity or sexual transgression in Adler's works. Almost alive, they purr, bristle, and move with stealth through stilled, painted interiors. Adler was primarily concerned with urbane living, the city as habitus, where, moving comfortably between languages and cultures, he found an echo for his cosmopolitanism. The appearance of three closely related, eye-catching studies of rural subjects are therefore a rare occurrence and deserve brief mention. In the first and most elaborate, a brush drawing made with washes of blue, black, and red oxide ink, the artist surveys the surrounding farmyard strewn with agricultural tools, a cart and wheels contained within a framing border. The small, well-camouflaged figure, lower right, peers from the scene as if alert to an intruder. Adler returned to the scene in a second, abbreviated monochrome study made with quick, nervous, jabbing marks and a metal pen. A third and loose sheet, identical in size, but now in the collection of the Von der Heydt Museum, Wuppertal, completes the sequence. Instead of a metal pen, Adler employs a reed pen or quill and red oxide ink. The accidental transfer of blue ink remnants from one of the adjoining pages confirms its place in the sequence. As we see from this and other examples, the rewards of collaboration are many, for the researcher and for participating institutions, uncovering synergies, completing a picture that might otherwise remain obscured. Close attention to the range of autograph marks yields further insight. The experience of a long and often circuitous journey that for Adler began at the margins, drawn to the centers of culture, sharpened an ear for the nuances of language, an attentiveness to the syntactical structure of drawn marks, their expressive and symbolic possibilities. These factors influenced his choice of sketchbooks, portable, economical, and lightweight, as the preferred medium for what would be a daily rehearsal. The intelligence of the hand, and with it, the invention of new visual forms. A microcosm of the studio, recording the contingencies of travel, sketchbooks offered other clear advantages, conferring order and seriality on a stream of images that seem at first viewing aleatory and unplanned. Profuse annotations inside the covers of Sketchbook 4 confirm his temporary lodgings at 3 Belgrave Terrace, a short distance from the community of some 15,000 Jews in the Gorbals district of Glasgow, where synagogues, Jewish schools, welfare institutions, kosher butchers, bakers, and delicatessen thrived. In the pages that follow, several studies reveal Adler's understanding of, yet ambivalence toward, the minhag, the obligations and traditions that govern the choreography and ritual of the synagogue service. My apologies. In the first, a shadowy figure in profile, right, stands at the threshold of the sanctuary looking in. Viewed up close, his features are demonstrably those of Adler himself. By contrast, the seated figure in rapt prayer and wearing the ritual talit, prayer shawl, and tefillin, phylacteries, has a grand, almost imperious bearing, summoning the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. In the second sheet, on your left, we encounter the congregation at large, Kehillah in Hebrew, and at its center, the synagogue's chazan, or cantor, wearing the Ashkenazi onion-domed ceremonial head covering. Over leaf, page on your right, cantor and congregation dissolve into an eddy of swirling lines that onion dome now a distant orb. Adler was well aware of the existential threats which the war in Europe posed to Jewish life. Back in Glasgow, he received news that members of his entire family had been murdered in circumstances that still remain unclear. Modernism, emancipation, and assimilation placed new pressures on Jewish communities beyond the shtetl. Restless and on the move, Adler himself evinced a cultivated detachment from his own culture of origin, practicing an unconditional receptivity to cultural others. Those concerns make Adler a subject of intense interest today, asking us to reflect, in author Julia Kristeva's words, on, quote, a mature acceptance of the otherness within us all, unquote. The recent publication of Yankel Adler Metamorphosen des Körpers, Metamorphoses of the Body, von der Museum Wuppertal 2022, with an introductory essay by Katerina Kostyuchenko, offers new insight and useful parallels with Tate's digitized holdings. One group of studies in particular sheds new light on what is perhaps one of Adler's most evocative post-war works, Treblinka, 1948, or Treblinka, so titled after the notorious extermination camp located northeast of Warsaw, where an estimated 700 to 900,000 Jews were murdered during the deadliest phase of the final solution. These studies graphically recall the Orthodox ritual known as kaparot, the live slaughter of an animal, a boiling fowl or similar, in accordance with halachic or religious law ahead of the Yom Kippur service, the Day of Atonement, the most solemn date in the Hebrew calendar. The earliest of these sketches, a fleeting sketch drawn in ink, shows the butcher boy with his block, bucket, and the sacrificial bird strung up by its talons. This and the adjacent group of studies, also in the von der Heydt Museum, confirm the theme of sacrifice, and together with a more accomplished pen and ink drawing private collection, London, provide the impetus for the protagonist at the center of Adler's Treblinka 1948. Adler's personal papers reveal a prescient regard for developments in Europe and the deadly and grinding progress of the war. They include a copy of a service of prayer and intercession issued by the Office of the Chief Rabbi in London in 1940, and a group of press cuttings that appeared shortly after liberation of Majdanek camp at Lublin, Poland, on the 22nd and 23rd of July 1944. In the aftermath of World War II, a resistant strain of figuration swept through Europe in step with prevailing ideas: Marxism, anarchism, existentialism, psychoanalysis, and the death of God. Invoking the language of new figuration, Kostyuchenko suggests that representations of the broken or fragmented body in Adler's work are an expression of the profound and shattering experiences of war, exile, and grievous loss. The metamorphoses and myriad permutations of the body that we see in Adler's work aptly reflect, quote, the fragility of human existence, unquote. Those earlier studies we looked at a moment ago clarify persistent doubts over the iconography of the protagonist at the center of this remarkable work, inviting commentary and some far-fetched interpretation. Art historian Ziva Meisels invoked the traumatic memory of the recent past, insisting that Adler's abstraction, his retreat from representation, signaled a withdrawal or incapacity to face the horrors of the Holocaust directly. Instead, she observed, he broached the subject tangentially through a personal mythology of coded signs with precedents in the Agadic literature associated with magic spells, but also, I would add, the ornately illustrated pages of the Haggadah read over the Passover meal. Maisel cites other sources for the loathsome, quote, two-headed hydra, unquote, a reference to this towering figure, adding that at Treblinka, Adler seems to imply in 1948, the year of the establishment of the State of Israel, the Germans succeeded in chopping off the head of the Jewish people, but in its place two immediately grew, unquote. In Treblinka, those upstretched limbs, like the upended talons of the sacrificial bird, sound a different chord. Before, during, and after the war, Jewish artists such as Max Chagall in Paris, William Gropper in New York, and Hans Feibusch in London and Chichester appropriated the image of a Jewish Christ, the crucified Son of God, as a powerful symbol of Jewish suffering, victimization, and sacrifice during World War II. With their tense angularity and disturbing synthesis of human and animal forms, and I'm going to interrupt myself here just to say that I'm drawing my argument to a close with this image. With their tense angularity and disturbing synthesis of human and animal forms, a group of contemporary studies in Tate archives reveal Adler's sullen mood in the last year of his life, a mood also echoed in the work of the group of young British sculptors exhibiting together at the Venice Biennale in 1952. In a review of their work, the renowned art critic Herbert Reed remarked, "These new images belong to the iconography of despair or of defiance, and the more innocent the artist, the more effectively he transmits the collective guilt. Here are images of flight or ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas, of excoriated flesh, frustrated sex, the geometry of fear." Far from signaling, in Maisel's words, a retreat from representation or an incapacity to face the horrors of the Holocaust, Adler's synthesis of figuration and abstraction augur an even more portentous subject: the devastating consequences for humanity of technology's destructive potential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah McDougall for a very different take on Adler and his archive. Sarah is director of Ben-Uri Gallery and Museum and heads the Ben-Uri Research Unit for the study of the Jewish and immigrant contribution to the visual arts in Britain since 1900, as well as Ben-Uri's collections and exhibition programming. She co-curated Yankel Adler, a degenerate artist in Britain 1940 to 49 in 2019, and presented Europe in Scotland, Joseph Herman, Yankel Adler, and the Émigré contribution to Scottish visual arts 1940 to 43 at the University of Edinburgh online conference in 2022. Sarah is a committee member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, University of London, and she co-edited Yearbook 18 on émigrés and the applied arts. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Following on from Glenn's wide-ranging discussion of Yankel Adler through the lens of cosmopolitanism, my paper now narrows the focus to explore a short defined period and specific locale within Adler's peripatetic life, tracing his personal and artistic exilic narrative during the 3 years that he spent in wartime Scotland. Although this paper is not wholly focused on the Tate Émigré archives, it does seek to discover what Adler's recently digitized sketchbooks may tell us about this sojourn, its influence, if any, upon his practice, and his cultural engagement with the city of Glasgow and the artist's colony at Kirkcudbright en route. In questioning the wider relationship between archives and biography, it becomes apparent that, In spite of, or perhaps because, of their richly diverse content and lack of straightforward chronology, a linear reading is neither advisable nor indeed possible, particularly within a biographical framework. In fact, the sketchbooks offer further proof, should it be needed, that the fractured histories of the émigré, particularly those, like Adler, who had been repeatedly displaced, transiting through multiple host countries and leaving traces in each, can never be fully reconstructed. Instead, materials such as the sketchbooks allow us valuable glimpses into the artist's rich imagination and working processes, offering further fragments that, when pieced together from multiple sources, help recover parts of these still incompletely gathered émigré narratives. Jankel Adler arrived in Scotland on the 22nd of June 1940, as we have heard, evacuated with the Polish army from Dunkirk. Driftwood, as the artist Michael Middleton termed it, cast upon a foreign shore by the European hurricane. He once again faced the uncertain task of attempting to rebuild his life, career and reputation in a foreign land. Yet this time, one in which he was not known and unable to draw upon the established European networks he had so formally done so. His slate, as Middleton further observed, had been wiped clean. Yet, as Anne-Marie Heibel's catalogue raisonné of the artist's paintings attests, in the 9 years remaining to him, he not only completed a large body of new work, around 240 paintings and innumerable sketches and drawings, but also established himself once more as a painter of reputation and influence in this, his third and final host country. Although less than 50 paintings are credited to his Scottish years, arguably, as with fellow Polish-Jewish refugee artist Joseph Herman, with whom Adler would shortly be reunited in Scotland, this period represented a settled interlude, allowing him the space and opportunity to revisit and develop themes which had been present in his work since 1933, referencing his national, Jewish and artistic identities, his dislocating experience as a refugee from Nazism, and the horrors of warfare. During this period, as we have heard, he would initiate some of his most significant late works and/or to begin the working process towards others, such as The Mutilated, No Man's Land, and The Beginning of the Revolt, which he would complete shortly after in London. Initially, Adler was sent to a camp in Sanquhar in Dumfries in Galloway for further training as a soldier, but a little-known account transcribed by Herman has revealed that by September he was confined to the Polish Army's disciplinary camp at Kingledores near the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed in the Scottish borders. He was visited by a Polish Catholic priest, Father Jan Starostka, who noted that Adler was grateful for any books or magazines, wore the Polish Army uniform, was timid and shy and took his punishment quietly, but did not mention that he was an artist until Yom Kippur, the 11th to 12th of October 1940, when he suddenly asked for canvas. When only an old tabletop from the laundry could be found, Adler improvised, drawing upon it first in charcoal, and then painting in oils that he had with him a highly idiosyncratic version of the famous Madonna, the Polish Madonna of Częstochowa, draped in pearls and precious stones, but with tears in her eyes, surrounded by Polish children lamenting their dead mothers, instead of the traditional angels near her crown. Adler's Madonna from Kingledores is sadly lost, but was clearly an image of mourning, not only for a lost nation and its people, the grieving mother perhaps inspired by Picasso's Guernica, but also referencing Adler's own enforced separation from his partner Betty Kohlhaas and their daughter Nina, who remained in Germany, one step ahead of the Gestapo throughout the war. The lost painting surely informs Adler's weeping mother, cradling her own child tensely and protectively in Mother and Child 2, painted in Glasgow shortly afterwards. Technically, Adler continued as a soldier until the 23rd of January 1941, when he was finally discharged due to a heart condition. In practice, he was released shortly after Yom Kippur, finding temporary accommodation with a minister in Coatbridge in North Lanarkshire, about 10 miles east of Glasgow. Using his notebooks for studies of male and female figures, nudes, ritual objects, studio interiors, and still lifes, he also included ephemeral everyday details, types of loose pipe tobacco and likely addresses of possible Glasgow studios, and names of Polish acquaintances in Glasgow among them. One of his first significant actions was to make an inventory of works inscribed Coatbridge 6, 24th of October 1940. In December, Adler made the move to Glasgow, where his earliest supporter, the Estonian-born Jewish sculptor Benno Schatz, generously gave him his first exhibition in his own studio. Schatz was then head of sculpture and ceramics at Glasgow School of Art and extremely influential in Jewish communities. He introduced Adler to a network of Jewish supporters, and these included businessman Ephraim Goldberg, who commissioned a portrait of his two young children, Mark and Myra, which satisfied neither party. Adler resented the commission, explaining that he was not a journeyman, and left the work unsigned, while Goldberg, having commissioned it out of sympathy for Adler's plight, disliked it and consigned it to the family's attic for many years. As the Blitz took hold on Glasgow and Adler retreated to the shelters, he painted many small pictures to alleviate his boredom, and because, as he explained to a later patron, there was no opportunity to work on a larger scale. Through Schatz, Adler was also reunited with Joseph Herman, whom he had known briefly in Warsaw. They shared not only their Polish and Yiddish language, a direct conduit to their Jewish roots, but also, Herman wrote, more intimate fears, an understanding so profound, he recalled, that in the company of others they became a conspiracy of two. In 1942, when Herman suffered a breakdown after hearing the terrible news that his entire family had been killed in the Warsaw Ghetto, it was Adler who nursed him back to health with maternal tenderness. Afterwards, he presented him with the sombre painting Orphans, in which two figures, one apparently clutching a letter, are imprisoned behind a bar, staring out at the viewer with haunted eyes, the canvas surrounded by a black border reminiscent of mourning cards. Significantly, the work was painted before Adler received this news, but Herman identified himself as one figure and the other as Adler, and he hung it over his mantelpiece for the rest of his life. Adler stayed briefly with the young Scottish artist William Crosby in January 1941, with whom he could perhaps reminisce about Paris, where Crosby had lived from 1937 to 1939, while studying under Leger and Mayol. He would join Adler and Herman among the many artists and writers in Glasgow in this period, who contributed to what Dennis Farr called, quotes, a surprising resurgence of vitality in all the creative arts in the city at a time which could hardly have seemed less propitious for such a revival, end quote. Both became influential members of the Glasgow New Art Club, formed as an alternative to the established Glasgow School of Art and the Glasgow Art Club, and founded by Scottish colourist J.D. Ferguson and his wife Margaret Morris, founder of the eponymous dance schools, and in August 1940 of the Celtic Ballet. Although Dennis Farr has suggested also that they helped to inject a new, quotes, spirit and sense of professionalism into the Glasgow art world, end quotes, this may be overstated. as Alice Strang has previously established that far from a cultural backwater, with the outbreak of the Second World War, the centre of progressive Scottish art had in fact transferred from Edinburgh to Glasgow. Contemporary Scottish artist Donald Bain later wrote that, quotes, "No one in London knows of the movement and tremendous upsurge in Glasgow in 1940, end quote. And Adler too, in the summer of 1943, would write of, quotes, standing with both feet in the midst of a cultural upsurge, despite the wave of destruction caused by the war. His influence has been cited in the strong expressionist flavour common to much of the work shown at the New Art Club and its successor, the New Scottish Group. Adler and Herman have also both been credited with inspiring the birth of the New Art Club's short-lived offshoot, the Centre, which opened in spring 1941 at 7 Scott Street, founded by the left-wing aristocrat and publisher David Archer, and later described as, quotes, a sort of aspiring ICA in Glasgow. Established with funds raised by the sale of paintings donated by members, decorated downstairs by Adler and upstairs by Herman, the centre combined a gallery, bookshop and coffee room. Its first secretary was R. Crombie Saunders, later editor of Scottish Art and Letters. He may have given Adler one of the sketchbooks, number 5, I believe, which is from Hill Head School, where he himself had been educated. During its 18-month duration, the centre held literary events, including poetry readings, including by Dylan Thomas, and 4 solo exhibitions, one each on Adler, Herman, and the 2 Scottish painters Crosby and Andrew Taylor Elder, the latter much influenced by the Eastern European melancholy or Weltschmerz discernible in Adler and Herman's work. Painter and later filmmaker Louise Anand, the sometime secretary, record members' familiarity with the work of Franz Marc and Paul Klee from the tour of the 1939 exhibition of 20th century German art, originally held the year before at London's New Burlington Galleries as a riposte to the Nazi degenerate art show, and then touring to Glasgow's McClellan Galleries in Sauchiehall Street. She described this as opening a window for the young Scottish artists. Adler, who had met Picasso and worked alongside Klee, impressed them as a living link to these artists and a direct conduit to European modernism. Sadly, no catalogues nor the centre itself from these exhibitions have survived, and it has been suggested that the demise of the centre coincided with Adler's own departure from Glasgow. It has been further suggested that during this period, Adler acted as unofficial arts advisor to Archer. In 1942, his Parton Press had published the Greenock-born W.S. Graham's second book of poems, Cage Without Grievance, illustrated by recent Glasgow School of Arts graduates, Robert Frame and Benjamin Krem, reflecting their admiration and emulation of Adler and through him Picasso in their distinctive graphic style. They joined a small group of artists who gathered around Adler, the master, they called him, and he taught them informally, mainly through criticism and example. Frame described Adler's most outstanding virtue as a painter as, quotes, his acute sensitivity to the matière and the extraordinary imagination with which he used it. Adler's first solo exhibition in Glasgow, comprising 24 works, opened at Annan's Gallery, 518 Sauchiehall Street, on the 4th of June 1941, with J.D. Ferguson contributing the catalogue forward, in which he welcomed Adler as an artist in whose work could be found, quotes, great force and extreme sensibility, a great contribution to Scotland's fight for free expression in art and liberation from the idea that photographic and anatomical accuracy are standards for judging painting. These works of Adler's are some of the best modern paintings I've seen. Is Scotland hospitable enough to see their great qualities and to benefit by them? A local paper, in reviewing the exhibition, echoed this point. What may be questioned they pointed out, is whether this type of art, which originated from foreign and different conditions, will be appreciated in the Scotland of today. Although Adler claimed that, quotes, "For the painter, the bagpipe sounds are a new colour to his palette. The Hebridean songs and the songs of the Highlands are a doorway to a new space," end quote. There is little sign that his sojourn in Scotland specifically influenced his work. Instead, the titles of his works, including Orphans, Death of Erich Mussbaum, Anguish, Death of a Peasant, and Mother and Child Too, demonstrate how he continued to draw upon his Jewish heritage and his recent traumatic experiences. In his autobiography, Schatz explained that Adler's exhibition at Annan's Gallery was a commercial failure, and it was this which induced him to inaugurate the art collection of the Glasgow Jewish Institute, which had been founded some years earlier at Portland Street in the Gorbals. According to the Jewish Chronicle from the 29th of August 1941, 2 pictures by Adler, described as a Polish Jewish artist, have already been presented to the new collection. Quotes, "The first, presented by Mr. Jack Handsome JP, is entitled Jewish Still Life and depicts a Sefer Torah, menorah, and other symbols of Jewish religious life. The other, jointly presented by Messrs. Black and Mandel, is the death of a martyr and portrays the dying agonies of a Jew in a concentration camp," end quotes. Sadly, when the Institute closed in the 1960s, the works were sold off at Sotheby's and have since disappeared. Adler participated in 2 further Glasgow art exhibitions, at the New Scottish Group in November 1942 and the exhibition of Jewish art co-curated by Schatz and Herman at the Jewish Institute in the Gorbals in December 1942, staged as an act of Jewish cultural identity in the face of Nazism. It introduced the Scottish public for the first time to European Jewish masters, many from the School of Paris, including Chagall, Manet Katz, Modigliani, Soutine and Zadkine, as well as British Jewish painters, including David Bomberg, and more recent refugees from National Socialism, the majority of whom Adler would afterwards encounter in London, including Alva, Martin Bloch and Hans Feibuch, as well as the curators themselves. Adler showed 2 oils, The Death of Erich Mussbaum, one of the lost works, the Jewish writer and anarchist murdered by the Nazis in Orienberg concentration camp, who has also been commemorated in works by George Gross, and Mother and Child, the 3rd showing for this picture, which was clearly important to him. Earlier, in August 1942, Adler had relocated to the celebrated colony in Kirkcudbright in southwest Scotland, initiated by the Glasgow Boys and nicknamed the Scottish St Ives, which continued to attract artists and craft workers for almost a century, including in the 30s and 40s, Lena Alexander and James Gunyon Tim Jeffs. However, Adler's work has nothing in common with these artists, and he seems to have made no contacts among them. He may have followed Margaret Morris's relocated summer school, but his 9-month stay probably resulted instead from his friendship with the poet W.S. Graham, part of his left-wing Glasgow circle and then unofficial poet-in-residence at the new Kilcahanty School near Castle Douglas. It was Graham who translated into English Adler's article Memories of Paul Clay, published in October 1942, in Horizon, the left-leaning literary journal funded by Peter Watson and edited by Cyril Connolly. Thereafter, Adler devoted himself to create an ambitious portfolio of works for his upcoming exhibition at the Redfern Gallery, London, in June 1943, organised by Émigré Erica Browson and including the standing nude Venus of Kirkcudbright, representing, quotes, the primeval figure of the European woman, end quotes, rather than a specific Kirkcudbrightshire model. It was David Archer who began the move back to London, and Adler would follow, having established patronage with influential patrons, which included Peter Watson, who would afterwards buy the important work, The Beginning of the Revolt in London. In conclusion, in Scotland, Adler had built up his networks, both Jewish, artistic, literary and avant-garde, made a body of new work and picking up on the narrative of his previous work. The archive contributes to the biographical story of Adler and, most importantly, allows us glimpses into his working process.